Hello and welcome back to Biggest Little Victory. Today we are going to cover the word rend, as well as look at a passage in Ruth and just see what it means to give control back to God. So this was a series that we started a while back in the fall here at Victory Christian Fellowship, and it's called the RE series. So it's taking words that start with the letters RE out of the Bible and just kind of seeing what they mean both to the context at the time and what it can mean for us today. So we just restarted the RE series with a second half here in the spring. And as I said, this word is rend for today. So we're going to go over rend in a passage in Ruth in just a moment. So thank you for joining us. By the way, this is Stephen. Kendra is not here today. So unfortunately, all you Kendra fans, you're going to be stuck with me today. But she will hopefully be back next week and in future podcasts. So hang tight, and we're going to get started. Okay, so we are here in Ruth chapter 2, starting at verse 5, going through verse 23. Now, if you want to follow along, please do. I'm going to be reading out of the New Century Version. If you have a different version, then go ahead and follow along with that as well. You might get a little bit of a different meaning, might be able to take something else out of the passage just by being able to compare translations and versions to each other. But I'm going to read out of the New Century Version. If you want to go ahead and move past this part, you can. But I'm going to go ahead and start with verse 5. Then Boaz asked his servant in charge of the workers, "Whose girl is that?" The servant answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please, let me follow the workers cutting grain and gather what they leave behind." She came and has remained here from morning until just now. She has stopped only a few moments to rest in the shelter. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen, my daughter. Don't go to gather grain for yourself in another field. Don't even leave this field at all, but continue following closely behind my women workers. Watch to see into which fields they go to cut grain and follow them. I have warned the young men not to bother you. When you are thirsty, you may go and drink from the water jugs that the young men have filled." Then Ruth bowed low with her face to the ground and said to him, "I am not an Israelite. Why have you been so kind to notice me?" Boaz answered her, "I know all about the help you have given your mother-in-law after your husband died. You left your father and mother and your own country to come to a nation where you did not know anyone. May the Lord reward you for all you have done. May your wages be paid in full by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for shelter." Then Ruth said, "I hope I can continue to please you, sir. You have said kind and encouraging words to me, your servant, though I am not one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz told Ruth, "Come here. Eat some of our bread and dip it in our sauce." So Ruth sat down beside the workers. Boaz handed her some roasted grain, and she ate until she was full. She even had some food left over. When Ruth rose and went back to work, Boaz commanded his workers, "Let her gather, even around the piles of cut grain. Don't tell her to go away. In fact, drop some full heads of grain for her from what you have in your hands, and let her gather them. Don't tell her to stop." So Ruth gathered grain in the field until evening. Then she separated the grain from the chaff, and there was about 1/2 bushel of barley. Ruth carried the grain into town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also took out the food that was left over from lunch and gave it to Naomi. Naomi asked her, "Where did you gather all this grain today? Where did you work? Blessed be whoever noticed you." Ruth told her mother-in-law whose field she had worked in. She said, "The man I worked with today is named Boaz." Naomi told her daughter-in-law, "The Lord Bless him. He continues to be kind to us, both the living and the dead." Then Naomi told Ruth, "Boaz is one of our close relatives, one who should take care of us." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "Boaz also told me, 'Keep close to my workers until they have finished my whole harvest.'" But Naomi said to her daughter-in-law Ruth, "It is better for you to continue working with his women workers. If you work in another field, someone might hurt you." So Ruth continued working closely with the workers of Boaz, gathering grain until the barley harvest and the wheat harvest were finished. And she continued to live with Naomi, her mother-in-law. So the passage that we are reading and the word rend sometimes don't seem like they align, at least in this aspect, because the passage that we just read is this beautiful example of love. And love on the part of family, love on the part of God for taking care of Ruth and Naomi in such a difficult time. But comparing that to the word rend, which is to cause great emotional pain, we wonder where exactly that fits into the story. So if we take a little look back into chapter 1 and get the idea of where this all came from. So what happened was Israel was undergoing a famine, and it was so bad that Naomi and her husband decided to go to Moab because there was no famine there. And they would go and would one day return to Israel when things were better. So they left and they all went to Moab. It was Naomi, her husband, and their 3 sons. And when they got to Moab, there were 3 Moabite women who agreed to marry those sons. So the family just became that much bigger. Unfortunately, the husband died, and all 3 sons died, leaving Naomi and her 3 stepdaughters alone. And Naomi was so upset by this turn of events that she just decided, I'm out of here, and I'm going back to Israel, and I can't stay here anymore. So she left, and on the way out, the 3 stepdaughters said, well, we're all coming with you. And she said, no, you can't. I have nothing for you. I have no more sons for you to marry. I can't offer you anything. Go back to your families, go back to your gods, go back to your country, and leave me. And 2 of the stepdaughters did. They left, they went back to their families, and probably forgot all about the whole situation. But Ruth refused. Ruth refused to leave, and Naomi continued to persist and say, no, you need to go back. I don't have anything for you. And then Ruth said, where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. And it's this beautiful passage of sincere commitment and devotion. And Naomi was so touched, she finally relented and said, okay, you can come. So they came back to Israel together, poor, destitute widows, and they were wondering what they're going to do to survive. So Ruth decided, I'm going to go out into the fields and I'm going to gather. And of course, the field that she happened to go into was owned by Boaz, who is a close family relative. And that just shows the provision of God in such dark, dark times for this family. So this whole act of rending is something that Ruth did when she chose to go with Naomi. This wasn't just a simple decision of, well, I want to go with you because I flipped a coin and it landed on heads and I guessed heads, so I guess I'm coming with you. This was a much more serious situation of she left everything that she knew and loved behind. She left her sisters, she left her friends, any other family that she had in Moab. She also left the culture of Moab behind because she was coming to Israel, which lived by a whole different set of rules. And this was a very, very brave act by a young woman to decide, I'm going to go live in a completely different country. She chose to be a refugee. And that is just such an amazing story of just what devotion and love can mean. But it was also a very, very trying time for Ruth because she had just lost her husband. And was now deciding to not only leave behind her husband who was buried in Moab, but to leave behind her whole life for Israel. And that whole process of essentially tearing herself in half, that she was now becoming something different than what she had been. And rending your heart towards God is to tear yourself away from your old life. It's to tear yourself away from who you used to be. Whether that was good or bad, we're tearing ourselves away from our past and saying, I'm committing. I'm going to be with God. I choose to be with God. But it's more than just tearing your heart away from your old life. It's tearing your heart away from your rebellion towards God, from your selfishness, and especially from your idea of what the right morals are. That one is pretty tricky. Tearing yourself away from what you think is correct, what you think is right in life. And this is one of the struggles of being a Christian. It's not an easy thing, because if it's easy, then you haven't read your Bible all the way through. It's what I tell people, is it's not an easy thing, because one, it's easy to accept that, God is love. Okay, God is love. Okay, well, let me look at some passages where it talks about God telling the Israelites to wipe out an entire nation because they were wicked and evil. But when he's saying this, he's not talking about a corrupt government or the soldiers who are responsible for pillaging and taking the materials of another nation. He's talking about the government, the leaders, the soldiers, the women, and the children. So when you say, it's easy to accept that God is love, but then you read a passage where God says, eliminate all of the children. What do you do with that? Is God still love? Can you still serve a God who said that? Because that's not something that God used to be. The thing about God's character is it doesn't change. God doesn't change. He doesn't evolve. He's not learning from humanity. He's not thinking, I was kind of mean back then, and I'm not going to be that way anymore. There is no hesitation in who God is. He is who he is. And unfortunately for us, that's really hard to understand, because there are a lot of things that God does that we don't quite understand fully. And that is certainly one of those pieces where he says, eliminate the women and the children. And you think, why? Especially when you read a story like Ruth, where she grew up in Moab, so she grew up in what would be considered an evil country, and yet she came to Israel and was even the grandmother of David, King David. So she got to be a part of an amazing royal lineage, but she wasn't even an Israelite. So if God can rescue someone like Ruth out of Moab, why couldn't he save the other children from the other nations? Why did they have to be sacrificed? Why couldn't they be brought into Israel and taught to live as Israelites, taught to live and serve God? Those are some of the hard questions when you become a Christian. Those are some of the hard questions that you need to ask. Asking questions is absolutely encouraged, because it's the only way that you become solid in your faith, solid in what you believe, and solid against challenges from the outside, because you're going to get challenged as a Christian, why you believe in God and how you can believe in God. And if you're not ready with some kind of an answer, that's going to be trouble more so for you, because it's going to cause great agony for yourself when you're trying to come up with this answer and not having something, especially when someone points out a verse like this. Well, do you believe that God did this? If so, how is he loving then? How is a God that's loving do something like that? So that's something that I have struggled with for a long time, and I don't think I'll ever stop struggling with it. I think that's always going to be something that's really difficult to grapple with, this idea that God has made some decisions throughout history that I would not have made. Decisions that I do not agree were the right move. But that's the thing, is that that's not my call. God did it. It's done. And now the answer, or the question to me is, can I still serve a God that has done those kinds of things, even if I don't understand why? So when you are rending yourself away from what you think is the right idea of a moral, you are deciding to put that control in God's hands, the control of what you think is right and wrong, the control, even if it goes against the mainstream. And that's even harder, because if you're swimming upstream, you're going against everyone else who is telling you that what you believe is wrong or hateful or consists of bigotry. That is a really difficult position to find yourself in, and will certainly put your faith to the test of what you really believe and whether you believe it's worth continuing. So Kendra was very nice to lend me her notes that she took for Sunday. Like I said, she couldn't be here this week, but hopefully she'll be back next week. And we are going to take a look at some of these. So one of them that stood out to me certainly was this. There was this note that she says, "We cannot fall prey to our bad history." So we can't let who we were take back control of our lives. The whole point of the cross, the whole point of Jesus giving us a second chance, a third chance, a fourth chance, continuing to keep his arms open and ask us to keep coming back to him, is because he doesn't want us to fall back into who we were. Now, he accepts you as you are. So as you come to God, that is how you are received, because you are already loved. There is nothing that you have to do. There is nothing that you have to get down your knees and pray a certain prayer or immediately change your ways in order for God to accept you. He already does. He already loves you, because Jesus already died for you. That already happened. It's not anything that you have to instigate. So you can already come to God as you are. Now the difficult part is when he starts to work in your heart and allow you to see who you used to be and who he has made you to be. And this is kind of the hard part, is some people don't want to let go of who they were because it made them strong, it helped them survive. And sometimes what God is asking you to do is something that goes against your nature. For some people, it's forgiving someone who we don't think deserves forgiveness whatsoever. You may have written this person out of your life and you're done with them, and yet God is moving in your heart and asking you to forgive them. And that can be a very difficult position to find yourself in, especially if this person has wronged you very, very terribly, to have to now turn around and forgive this person. But those are some of the things that God does when he gets some of the control that you've allowed him to have. He starts to work in your heart in ways that are unimaginable. So we can't fall prey to it, though. We can't go back to who we were. It's very easy to go back to who you were, especially if you're in the process of changing. That's when it's the most difficult time. Anyone who has started a diet or tried to start a new way of life knows that breaking your old habits are very, very difficult. Maybe the first couple of days, it's no big deal, and you think, wow, this is going to be easy. But then that withdrawal kind of hits in day 3 and 4, and it's real bad. And it's just really tempting to just go back to how you used to do things because it's comfortable, you know it, and what's the big deal? What's the harm? But to truly give control to God is to say, I don't want any part of who I used to be to govern who I am with God. It's to take God at his word and value what he is offering so much higher than anything else. And that is the true challenge of following Christ, is valuing what he is offering so far higher than anything else that you've ever valued in your life that you are willing to change everything. You're willing to let go of anything. Nothing else matters because of God. That's a very, very difficult point to reach, and it's a very humbling point to reach. To be able to put yourself aside and say, I want God to have complete control. That's a very, very humbling point to reach. So, what is this process of rending, and what does it cost? Because it's got to be huge. It's got to be big. And that is really what it is. It costs far more than we expect. Oftentimes, it's far more than we expect. We think that it's going to be a little bit difficult to try and see things God's way. I understand that, okay, but it'll get easier, right, with time. I think there are instances where it does get easier, but I also think there are a lot of times where it doesn't, where it gets even harder, especially the more you read the Bible and the more you understand the way that people lived and the world that the people lived in, back then, back in the times of the Bible, back in the Israelite times, back in the New Testament times, and all the way up to today. I think there are just a lot of situations where it's really hard to understand what God is doing. And the question, where was God when, fill in the blank, that question comes up a lot. Especially a lot of times throughout the Old Testament, and especially with the story of Job. He was the one who was asking that, where is God in this? What is happening? And his friends who were sitting with him began to think, maybe it's your fault. Maybe you did something wrong. And Job's thinking, I don't know what I did. So there's a lot of times where we stop and wonder, what is happening? My life is in such chaos right now. Where is God in all this? What is he doing? Because I don't see him moving. I don't see how he's helping me. I don't see how he's providing for me. What am I supposed to do? So these are the really, really tough times when we have decided to follow after God, and we realize that it's not all, tea and cupcakes. There's a lot of difficulty ahead. And I want to continue on with what this process does. So once we understand that it's going to cost more than we expect, we also need to expect that it's going to cause a change in our mind to see a different perspective. It makes us choose between what we know and the unknown on the other side. So I'd mentioned briefly about refugees and just what the bravery involved in being a refugee. That's not something that anyone should crave, because the people who today are leaving their countries because they are fearing for the safety of themselves and their family, they're doing so because they can't see themselves living where they are any longer. It is so dangerous and hostile that they would rather come to a completely different country that has a different language and different set of morals and cultural values, and they would rather do that than to stay where they are, because that's how bad things are. And that was the case for Ruth. She didn't feel like she had anything left in Moab. She had lost her husband. She lost 2 brothers-in-law. She lost her father-in-law. It was a huge, huge, difficult moment. But in that moment, she could have gone back to her family, stayed with her sisters, who she knew, and been comforted in that. But she decided that not only was she going to lose her husband and her father-in-law and her 2 brothers-in-law, but she was going to just decide to lose everything. She was willing to cut herself off from every bit of comfort and familiarity in Moab. She left behind her culture, left behind her country, left behind everything and everyone she'd ever known, except for Naomi, and come to a completely different land and live there instead. That's a very, very difficult choice to make, but to her, it was worth the cost. And that's the question, is God worth the cost for you to rend yourself from your old sinful life? Or do you want to continue living the way you want to live and try to compromise with God? I'm going to spoil one thing for you now, and you might not like this, but you actually can't compromise with God. There is no getting to live a little bit with some of my sinful nature, but not all of it. But then the rest of me is definitely all in. Definitely. But just let me kind of do things a little bit my way. There's no room for that. God is a God who asks for all or nothing. when a man came up to Jesus and said, "I'd like to follow you, but first let me go back and say goodbye to my parents." And Jesus' response was, "Let the dead bury their own dead." Well, let me go back and take care of this one thing. No one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for work in the kingdom of God. It was an all or nothing approach. You don't get to hold on to any little bit of your old life. You have to come with me all in right now. And that is, again, just another truth aspect of what it really means being a Christian, and what we're really asking when we're asking, do you want to believe in Jesus? It's not so much I guess I struggle with this idea because we've done this thing in the church where we say, here's a little prayer, you're going to pray this prayer, and that's how you're going to accept God into your life. And that's how you become a Christian, is that you're going to pray this certain prayer with certain words, and that is how you are going to become a Christian. And that is so, it's to me, it's watered down of what it really means to be a Christian. It doesn't really go into in-depth, because I think people should be given the full story before they're asked to sign on to something that they don't really completely know. Because imagine that you are asked to sign on to a way of life, and what they tell you sounds great, sounds good, so you say, yeah, I'll commit. But then as you start to dig deeper, you start to uncover truths that you really wish they had told you about before you'd gotten started, because you might not have been on board had you been told about these. And I think that happens with Christianity a lot. We accept Jesus because we pray a certain prayer, whatever it is. Everyone's got kind of their own twist on it. And then, okay, you're a Christian now. Congratulations. And here are these really cool verses that talk about how awesome God is. Here's this passage that talks about God making the world. Here's this passage that talks about God saving us, how he lives through us by his Spirit. This is all great stuff. And then you continue reading on your own, and you're thinking, well, yeah, this is really great, but what happened here? What happened with this whole weird sacrifice kind of a thing? What happened with Sodom and Gomorrah, and what was going on there? And you start to read all these other passages that start to make you wonder, what exactly did I sign up to follow? Because I don't remember any of this in the promotional material. And I think that we need to speak the whole truth, not just what we want people to understand about God and want to catch, but the whole truth. Because otherwise, it is our fault when they say, you didn't tell me everything. You left a lot out, a lot that should have been discussed before I was going to do this, because I really wanted to know if this was worth following, and I'm not sure anymore. But if we tell people the whole truth from the beginning, then they can count the cost. Here's what it might cost you. Now, in the United States, it might cost you some reputation. Some people might not think of you as intelligent when you decide to follow God. They think that, oh, that's unfortunate that you have to believe in God in this day and age. And so it might cost you a little bit of reputation. But that pales in comparison to what some people in other countries are dealing with. When they accept God, it could mean death. So let that sink in, that to them, following God, the same God that we're discussing, the God who has done such amazing wonders like parting the Red Sea, bringing down a pillar of fire, raising people from the dead, healing lepers instantly, helping the lame walk, the blind see, but also the same God who has ordered the slaughter of children and innocent women, who has wiped out nations, who has allowed just horrific atrocities to be carried out in his name. And to them, it's worth the cost that if someone else were to find out that they were following God, they could be killed for it. But they have counted the cost. They have made the very, very difficult decision of rending their hearts to God. Wow. That's all I can say to that is wow. And what an amazing testimony those people must have to be in such a position that they're willing to accept this God that they don't fully understand and know that they can never fully understand, because his ways are not our ways and his thoughts are not our thoughts. They're above our thoughts. It's on a whole different plane that we can't understand. And that's another phrase that makes people really upset, because they think, okay, so if you can't ever understand him, that's just a cop-out answer for God gets to do whatever he wants and we just can't understand why he's doing it. Partially that's true. God does get to do whatever he wants because he made everything. So he gets to make the rules. So unfortunately, that's kind of the more harsher truth of it, is that he does get to do what he wants. But the other side of the coin is that what he is doing is good, because God is inherently good. But we don't always see it that way. So how does that make any sense? Wouldn't we be able to see that what God is doing is good? Shouldn't we be able to see that what God is doing is good in some way? If he is all good and everything that he does is for the good, then why aren't we able to see it in some situations? Why does it seem so wrong? Yet another difficult question to ask as a Christian. But these are all questions that you should ask. And these are all questions that you should ask definitely someone that you trust. Don't ask yourself. Don't ask yourself alone, because you start to get into these patterns of questioning everything about yourself. But ask people in the church, ask people outside the church, just pursue an answer, pursue knowledge, and be completely informed. Because this is not something that you should ever have to just accept and move on. Jesus didn't want people to just come to him and accept him because of what he did. Everyone wanted to believe in him because, wow, he took that small boy's lunch and turned it into enough food to feed 4,000 people, and at a different time, 5,000 people, right? And that was just the men. They didn't count the women and children. So there was actually even more than those 4,000 or 5,000 people there. But he wanted to make sure that they weren't just following him for his miracles, but they were following him because they understood who he actually was. It's why he often spoke in parables, because he wanted to see who was interested enough to ask questions, to look for the answers, not just to accept it on the face value, because he could have said very plainly what he was about, and everyone would have either said, yeah, I'm for that, or no, thank you. But he spoke in a method that made people ask questions, at least those who really, really wanted to know. And those are the people that he wanted, the ones who were going to be curious enough to stick around and ask, what did you mean by that? I don't understand. Christianity should be modeled after that. Ask questions. Seek out the answers. Sometimes it's not always black and white in the Bible. An answer on some modern day hot button topics aren't easily found in the Bible. So what do you do with that? What do you do with those questions? Keep asking, keep searching, keep praying. I'm not saying that you'll ever find all the answers that you're looking for. Sometimes things remain a mystery, and they remain a mystery, and you go back and forth on them. But that is life. Regardless of whether you were a Christian or not, that's just life. There are some things that we just wrestle with. And that's okay, because that's what makes us human, is the fact that we wrestle with it. We don't just put it to bed and say, this is it, goodbye. That's how you have social stagnation, and why you can have the technology like we have today, and yet social progress has remained very, very slow over the centuries, despite how quickly our technology has improved. So that's what happens when you don't question morals, when you just decide, well, this is how we've always done it, so there you go. Ask questions, review what you believe, and certainly don't believe something simply because you were told to. Believe it because you believe it, because you've chosen it, because you have counted the cost. So when we rend our hearts toward God, it is giving ourselves to him entirely. We know that this is going to hurt, but he's got this. I like that. It's another one of Kendra's notes here, but he's got this. That is a trust aspect. So once you know who God is, so as you're introduced to this God and introduced to who he is, so imagine, put yourself in the position of Ruth for a moment. She's come into a new country. She's come to live amongst strange people and learn about this new God and to trust him to handle all of her issues. So you put yourself in this situation and you're this scared woman. You don't know what's going on. You're afraid. You could be hurt. You could be taken. You have no real protections in this foreign land. And being able to trust this God who you've just recently gotten to know and trust that he's got this. Despite how much it hurts, despite how much your heart has been torn in so many pieces, to trust that it's okay. Everything's going to work out. That's a lot to ask. Putting yourself in that position, that's a lot to ask. So imagine you're from the United States. Picture yourself going to a completely different country where you've never been before. They speak a different language. They have completely different cultural customs, and you're going there, leaving behind everything you know here in the U.S., going to this other country, and you're just supposed to trust that God's got this. It's okay. I don't know that many people that would agree with that and say, like, yeah, that's okay. I'm all right with that. I know a lot of people that would probably be screaming on the inside and maybe smiling and saying, yeah, everything's fine, but they're screaming really loudly on the inside because they have no idea what's going on. But Ruth had this complete trust. He's got this. I'm okay. I'm going to be okay. And that is just, again, yet another amazing aspect of her story, of just how much faith and courage this young woman had to do what she did. This is no small act. We can read through this really quickly. And we read through this, chapter 1, you read through chapter 1, and that's it. That's all that you learn about this girl and what happened to her life and how it just got turned completely upside down. And we can read past that and just skim it, and it seems so small. But this was someone's life. These were possibly years. This was a lot of time that went by. This was a heart-wrenching story that somebody lived. And to us, it's just a couple of pages, but to her, it was huge. It was everything. It was her entire life. Probably the most stressed out this poor girl has ever been. Probably the most stressed out that anyone's ever been. But she did it anyway and decided to trust this God anyway. And it's partially what is asked of us, to trust that when we give control of our hearts to God, that he's going to take care of us, that it's going to be okay. That is a really, really difficult aspect to do. But one advantage that we have over Ruth is that God has called us into community. So it's not something that we're doing by ourselves. It's not something that we have to do alone. It's the entire point of what it means to be the church, is that we don't have to do this alone. When we rend our hearts from our past selves, whether it's just our past or it's our very, very sinful past, we don't have to do this on our own. We can find others to support us. So as we're asking questions and we're looking and seeking out answers, we're not just asking them by ourselves to ourselves. We're not just running through the Bible hoping to just land on the right page, the correct verse that's going to speak exactly into that moment of our lives. We're diligently seeking out the companionship of others so that we make the correct decisions, so that we feel supported, so that we don't feel so alone. Now, Ruth had Naomi, but as a church, we can have more than just one person. We can have many people coming around us at all times. Those who are both new and older in the Christian faith, those who are more mature in the Christian faith, can come alongside you and help you with these moments. And that's what we're supposed to do. Someone is struggling with questions, it's not a time to silence that person and say, don't ask questions, just accept the answers. That's a time for them to understand this person has a lot of questions because they're feeling a lot of things, and that's okay. We're going to help you. So as we go through this RE series, we are going to deal with a lot of difficult conversations like this one. And rend is a particularly difficult word to deal with. Just this whole idea of tearing ourselves away from who we used to be and turning towards a God who's asking for more. So definitely stay tuned with us as we go through these words. We've got a few more. I think we've got 6 more RE words coming up, and Kendra and I will be talking about them and just really kind of being vulnerable to the Word of God. I think that's the part that's really difficult, is being vulnerable to the Word of God and letting it speak into our lives in a way that maybe it hasn't before. Even if you've read the passage 1,000 times before, being willing to step back and say, what can it say to me this time? What's something that I might have missed? Or even what's something that I just need to be reminded that this is an essential truth. So thank you all for tuning in to Biggest Little Victory. Today the word was rend, and again we read out of the passage of Ruth, chapter 2, verses 5 through 23. But please go ahead and read the entire book of Ruth. Read through it. It's a short book, but it's a beautiful book, and certainly beautiful in the courage that it took this poor girl and what she went through in choosing God and choosing a whole new life for herself. Be in prayer for yourself, for others, as we continue to go through this series, and as you continue to let God shape and mold your heart. It's going to bring challenging days, but it's also going to bring days of joy and peace. So be vulnerable to the Word. If there's anything that I can encourage you to do, it's to be vulnerable to the Word. Thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next week.